The national championship, the ultimate goal and crowning achievement for every program at the Division I level, standing atop the college football world as national champions, not only immortalizes the program, but it brings in revenue in the form of name, image, and likeness deals for its players, and it can increase their NFL draft stock. And for the coaches of college football, it can parlay into lucrative multi-year contracts, securing their future in a business where job security is a rare luxury. As many of you know, this has only been a privilege reserved for the blue bloods of college football. For example, programs such as Alabama, Ohio State, LSU, and Clemson have won multiple national championships between the Bowl Championship Series format and the most current college football playoff. In addition to this, the Southeastern Conference has dominated both championship formats, winning over 60% of the national championships over the span of 26 years. With this overwhelming dominance by a select few programs within college football, what chance does a smaller group of 5 mid-major program have of achieving the ultimate goal of winning the national championship? The short answer would be not a snowflake's chance in a volcano. So in today's video, we're going to go into a deep dive on why this is a common theme within college football. In addition to this, we're going to cover 2 programs as a case study, where one program had only 3 losses over the span of 4 seasons, and another program reeled off an epic 25-game win streak. Yet neither program had a chance to compete for the national championship. So if you like this type of content, please be sure to like and subscribe. So without further delay, we're going to jump right into our topic today. As we explore our topic, we're going to discuss these 2 case studies, as one team had an epic run during the Bowl Championship Series era, and this lasted from 1998 to 2013. This was a format that used factors including a computer ranking system that ultimately selected the number 1 versus 2 ranked teams to play for the ultimate crown. The other team rose to prominence during the 4-team playoff era, and this spanned from 2014 to 2024. And this was selected by a 12-member committee that composed of former politicians, coaches, and sports writers. We will dive into the factors that led to each team ultimately finding themselves excluded from the national championship picture. The first team we're going to cover in this discussion, you might have already guessed, and that's the Boise State Broncos. 2 years removed from that electrifying 2006 season, capping it off with a dramatic finish in the Fiesta Bowl, yielding one of the biggest upsets within college football history, which I cover in another video, and I will leave a link to that in the description below. This Cinderella story did not end after that epic win over Oklahoma in overtime. Boise reloaded, and in 2008, they blew away their competition with a freshman quarterback by the name of Kellen Moore. Kellen Moore, as a freshman, passed for 3,500 yards with 25 touchdowns, as Boise State reeled off 12 consecutive wins, including over the 17th ranked Oregon Ducks. Despite their high-powered offense and undefeated record, they were left out of the national championship conversation and the Bowl Championship Series New Year's 6 games, including the Sugar, Peach, Orange, Cotton, and Fiesta Bowl. And they had to settle for a lesser Poinsettia Bowl against the 11th ranked Texas Christian Horned Frogs, as they lost to TCU in a heartbreaking game, 16-17, that came down to the wire. Boise State looked onward to 2009 to prove to the college football world that they would not be ignored. The 2009 campaign was literally a copy and paste from that historic 2006 season, as they opened up the year defeating the 16th ranked Oregon Ducks, as Boise's defense held the Ducks to only 8 points. And after that game, Oregon running back LeGarrette Blount infamously punched an opposing player, causing an all-out brawl as a retaliation to trash talking from one of the Boise State defensive linemen. After that post-game incident, Boise continued their historic run as quarterback Kellen Moore passed for 3,500 yards with 39 touchdowns and only a mind-blowing 3 interceptions. Finishing undefeated, Boise was yet again left out of a chance to compete for the national championship, as the Broncos avenged their previous bowl loss, defeating TCU 17-10 in the Fiesta Bowl. They finished that season with a perfect 14-0 record. With only 1 loss in the span of 2 seasons, what would it take for a team like the Boise State Broncos to receive an invite to the BCS title game? The answer to that would be perfection, a prayer, and a miracle. Going into that 2010 season, the Boise State Broncos had an advantage that had eluded themselves and many teams in their position. They began the season ranked 5th in the country, which is the highest in school history, and this put them in pole position and increased their chances of finishing that particular season in the top 2 and a legitimate chance to compete for the Bowl Championship Series national championship. As Boise State looked onward to dominate the Mountain West Conference for that season, they would face a tragic sequence of events that would shatter their chances at winning a national championship. As the Boise State Broncos were undefeated and ranked 3rd in the country against their hated rivals, the Nevada Wolfpack, the Broncos found themselves in the fight of their lives against an unknown dual-threat quarterback that many of you may have never heard of, by the name of Colin Kaepernick. And he led the Nevada offense, and he pushed Boise State to the limit. Despite the game being close, Boise had a chance to actually win the game with a field goal as time expired. Their sure-footed kicker by the name of Kyle Brotzman not only missed the game-winning field goal in the fourth quarter, he would go on to miss another field goal in overtime, costing the Broncos the game and finding themselves on the wrong end of the biggest upsets in Mountain West Conference history. That loss was not only devastating to their national title hopes, it was their best and only chance in their program's history of reaching the title game. And that one blemish on their record bailed out the BCS selection process, because an undefeated Boise State would have caused a three-way tie between themselves, Auburn, and the Oregon Ducks. The following 2011 season, although impressive by many program standards, they suffered a tough midseason loss at the hands of their nemesis, the Texas Christian Horned Frogs. Despite taking control most of the second half, TCU made a crucial two-point conversion in the final minutes of the game. And this delivered the Broncos their only blemish on that 2011 season. Despite only one loss, it once again derailed their chances at a national championship, and they were relegated to compete in a lower bowl. In the Las Vegas Bowl, they destroyed the Arizona State Sun Devils in a lopsided 56-24 victory. A Boise State team that only had 3 losses over the span of 4 years, with a 4-year starting quarterback in Kellen Moore that threw for 14,600 yards with 142 touchdowns. It was absolutely criminal that the Broncos never had a chance to compete for the national championship. Despite Boise State's epic run during that 4-year span, the Bowl Championship Series Selection Committee had excluded the Broncos from national championship contention. However, the Broncos would have been facing an uphill climb during this time frame. Programs such as Alabama, Florida, and the Auburn Tigers had Heisman winners in Mark Ingram, Tim Tebow, and Cam Newton, with a host of future NFL prospects as these teams went on to win the national championship. And it could be argued by many sports writers, fans, and coaches that these iconic programs would have been entirely too much for the Boise State Broncos. As we move on to our next case study, we're going to cover the epic 2-year run of a program that rose from the ashes of an 0-12 season, and they nearly crashed the party of the college football playoff. And as this team was on the verge of making history, tragedy would strike, and it would not only change the trajectory of their program, but the life of their star quarterback. This would be none other than the epic run of the Central Florida Golden Knights. Before we dive into this portion of our discussion, we will have to go all the way back to 2013, when the Golden Knights of Central Florida burst on the scene, reeling off a 12-1 record, capping it off with a dramatic Fiesta Bowl victory over the Baylor Bears. As a mid-major Group of 5 program winning a BCS game, things were only looking up for the Golden Knights, and they were destined to dominate, despite being a smaller program in the Southeastern Conference and Atlantic Coast Conference hotbeds of the state of Florida. 2 years later, Central Florida would experience one of the most miserable seasons in the history of college football, and this would leave that program in utter disarray. In 2015, Central Florida failed to win a single game, and they etched their names in the College Football Hall of Shame. And if you want more in-depth coverage of that particular season, I would suggest you follow one of my favorite creators by the name of KTO, who covers this particular season in great detail. In addition to this, current United Football League kicker and content creator by the name of Donald De La Haye, which you may commonly know as Destroying, experienced this season firsthand, as he was the team's place kicker during that miserable 2015 campaign. As Central Florida dropped 12 straight games, they had to make some difficult decisions. First was dismissing their longtime head coach by the name of George O'Leary, who over the span of 12 seasons brought success to that program, as Central Florida hired former Nebraska standout and Oregon offensive coordinator by the name of Scott Frost. They were looking to get back on track. Next, they needed a major overhaul of their roster, including finding a quarterback of the future. Scott Frost recruited an undersized yet versatile dual-threat quarterback by the name of Milton. That would be the missing link, building their dynamic high-scoring offense. Of course, the results of this major overhaul of the UCF program, it was not instant, but 1 year removed from that awful 12-loss season, the Knights were making significant progress. In 2016, Central Florida won 6 games, which qualified them for a postseason bowl game. Milton had modest freshman stats, passing for 2,000 yards, 10 touchdowns, and 7 interceptions, in addition to suffering heartbreaking double overtime loss to Maryland, and a 1-point loss to Temple, which would have easily given the Knights an 8-4 record. Central Florida ended their season on a sour note, losing to Arkansas State in the Camping World Bowl. Despite this tough postseason loss, they finished with a 6-6 record and going 500, after losing 12 straight games the previous year. The following 2017 season, the Golden Knights of Central Florida, they were about to take the college football world by storm by disrupting the status quo and exposing the flaws of a broken system that was the college football playoff selection process. For that historic 2017 season, Central Florida put the entire college football world on notice as they obliterated their competition, averaging a mind-blowing 50 points a game, and their quarterback Milton posted 4,000 yards passing, with 38 touchdowns and only 8 interceptions. And if those numbers were not impressive enough, Milton rushed for an additional 600 yards with 8 touchdowns. Central Florida did not have one close game all season, with the exception of a double overtime 62-55 shootout, as they overcame the Memphis Tigers to win the American Athletic Conference Championship. As Central Florida stood 12-0, they were shamefully overlooked by the playoff committee in favor of blue blood programs such as Alabama, Clemson, Georgia, and Oklahoma. Now granted, those teams had strong arguments, and Georgia and Oklahoma gave us one of the most thrilling overtime wins in Rose Bowl history. Yet, this left Central Florida on the outside looking in, and they were invited to the Peach Bowl against the Auburn Tigers as a consolation prize. This playoff snub caused a major uproar from the Central Florida nation, and many sports writers bagged up their claims. Many accused the playoff committee of purposely pushing Central Florida down in the midseason rankings, making it mathematically impossible for this team to finish in the top 4 to qualify for the playoff. In addition, Alabama suffered a shocking upset against Auburn late in the regular season, missing out on the SEC conference title game. Auburn's unexpected yet mind-blowing upset over their hated rivals from Tuscaloosa. They were eventually routed by the Georgia Bulldogs in the SEC championship game. Despite that late SEC chaos, the committee still decided to overlook the Central Florida Golden Knights in favor of the Alabama Crimson Tide as the 4th and final member of the 2017 college football playoff. Several teams in Central Florida's position, they would have pouted and sulked and given a lackluster performance in their bowl game as they were left out of the national championship picture. However, Central Florida made good on their opportunity, and they put on a spectacular performance as Mackenzie Milton threw for 240 yards, rushing for 116, accounting for a total of 3 touchdowns. Defensive captain Shaquem Griffin terrorized quarterback Jarrett Stidham and the Auburn offense. As the game's defensive MVP, he had 12 tackles and 2 sacks, and Central Florida won the Peach Bowl 34-27, capping off a perfect 13-0 season. Central Florida's triumphant win over the Auburn Tigers in the Peach Bowl, they had just completed one of the most epic turnarounds in college football. And for that 2017 season, they were the lone undefeated team that year, and they claimed themselves national champions. However, this is controversial and it's up for debate, because clearly the Alabama Crimson Tide went on to defeat the Georgia Bulldogs in overtime, in an epic overtime thriller, and they finished their season 14-1. The playoff committee had made it obvious that it would take a miracle for a mid-major Group of 5 program such as Central Florida to make the playoff. The selection criteria to compete for the national championship had favored tradition over consistency and dominance. Many programs with this type of miracle story, they typically flame out, and they're unable to replicate this level of success. However, with Scott Frost's dynamic offense led by their electric dual-threat quarterback in Mackenzie Milton, along with their solid bend-but-don't-break defense, they were ready to yet again to make history and expose the bias of a corrupt selection process. As Central Florida was poised to take on their 2018 schedule, they would do it without their head coach Scott Frost, who in a shocking move left the program for the Nebraska job. Who in their right mind would leave after engineering one of the biggest rags to riches story in college football history? To be fair, Coach Frost was born and raised in Lincoln, Nebraska, and he was a dual-threat option quarterback for the Nebraska Cornhuskers. As Missouri offensive coordinator and former Oklahoma standout Josh Heupel, he would take over the Central Florida job. He would have large shoes to fill. Despite the sudden coaching change, the Knights of Central Florida would pick up where they left off, obliterating their competition, scoring a whopping 243 points in the span of their first 5 games. As they lit up the scoreboard and simultaneously playing solid on defense, the Knights were 10-0 going into their final game of the regular season against their hated rivals, the South Florida Bulls. Although the Knights were 2-touchdown favorites against their in-state rival, a tragic sequence of events would not only change the life of their star quarterback, but the entire UCF program as a whole. Early in the second quarter, it's 3rd down and 7. Mackenzie Milton rolls out to his right to evade pressure as the pocket collapsed to get first down yardage. As he's brought down by 2 South Florida defenders, his knee twists awkwardly and is dislocated in the most gruesome fashion imaginable. The severity of his injury is immediate, as both players and coaches from both teams look on in horror to see Milton lying on the turf holding his severely injured leg. Athletic training staffs from both Central and South Florida rush to his aid to assess the degree of his injury. Milton is immediately carted off the field and he's rushed to a local hospital. It didn't take years of medical training to see that his leg was dislocated at the knee. However, unknowingly, he was in a race against time, as this injury resulted in major veins and arteries being severed in his leg, which threatened the blood supply to his overall limb. This could potentially result in a syndrome called avascular necrosis, which can degrade the integrity of the joint, and permanently, and in most worst-case scenarios, it can result in limb amputations. Milton's future was in jeopardy, and his chances of a full recovery were grim. As freshman quarterback Darrell Mack took over for their fallen star player, They closed out the South Florida Bulls and they edged Memphis for the American Athletic Conference Championship. As Central Florida finished yet again undefeated prior to the playoff selection show, they were once again overlooked in favor of the usual suspects in Alabama, Clemson, Notre Dame, and Oklahoma. Imagine winning 25 straight games over the span of 2 seasons and being left out of the national championship conversation in back-to-back years. However, I do understand to some degree. Although Darrell Mack was a promising young quarterback, he struggled mightily in those games he did play. And with Central Florida's lack of offensive production, it didn't quite prove to the playoff selection committee that they would be competitive among some of the elite programs within college football. In the college football semifinals, Notre Dame was absolutely obliterated by the Clemson Tigers, 30-3. And per usual, the Alabama Crimson Tide dominated the Oklahoma Sooners. I truly believe Central Florida, with a healthy Mackenzie Milton, would have been a much more viable option, more than Notre Dame. And they could have possibly led to a dramatic upset, disrupting the status quo within college football. At the conclusion of that disappointing 2018 season, Central Florida would go on to lose to LSU in the Fiesta Bowl. This was mostly attributed to the lackluster quarterback play of Darrell Mack. And in the following season, LSU, led by quarterback Joe Burrow, will go on to have one of the most stacked rosters in college football history and win the national championship for the following 2019 season. So now that we've covered both of these iconic yet deserving programs, let's briefly go over what are the factors that kept both of these top programs out of the national championship conversation. I believe we can argue for both teams that the Bowl Championship Series selection process and the playoff selection committee chose tradition over dominance and consistency. The playoff yielded some bad matchups for the sake of holding that legacy over that consistency and dominance. Boise State had multiple hurdles to overcome during the Bowl Championship Series era. They would have to overcome a 2008 Tim Tebow-led Florida Gators, who absolutely destroyed the Ohio State Buckeyes. In 2009, the Alabama Crimson Tide were an absolute juggernaut with Mark Ingram and Julio Jones on offense, along with the NFL-studded defense that destroyed the Texas Longhorns in the Rose Bowl. In 2010, Auburn, led by Cam Newton, was a team for the ages as they would overcome DeMarcus Mariota and the Oregon Ducks. In 2011, although a prime example of SEC fatigue, Alabama would dominate LSU in a midseason rematch, claiming the national title. That 2010 season, if they had overcome Texas Christian, finishing as the third-ranked team, they might have skipped over Auburn or Oregon to play for the national championship. Central Florida had their own hurdles and barriers that kept them out of the conversation of the college football playoff. In 2017, many speculate that the playoff selection committee had purposely ranked them extremely low, which contributed to their exclusion to the playoffs. Due to forces beyond their control, Central Florida had to cancel games over those 2 seasons due to hurricanes. And as a result, this reduced their total wins for that season. Oklahoma and Clemson were selected for the playoff for that season, over an undefeated Central Florida, despite both teams having embarrassing regular season losses to lesser programs such as Iowa State and Syracuse respectively. In 2018, Mackenzie Milton's injury gave the committee that ounce of justification they needed to exclude Central Florida. And their lackluster play without Mackenzie Milton downgraded them from an elite team to just slightly above average. With Alabama and Clemson competing for the national championship, Clemson would absolutely obliterate the Alabama Crimson Tide. And as a nugget, I was actually at that game, and trust me, Alabama looked terrible in that contest. Notre Dame got destroyed in the semifinal against Clemson, and many would argue that should have been Central Florida's spot if Mackenzie Milton could have remained healthy. In the current 12-team playoff format, both programs would have had a legitimate chance to prove that they can compete with the elite teams within college football. Despite both of these programs having historic electrifying seasons, they were overlooked by a biased system that chose to uphold the status quo for the sake of TV ratings, as opposed to rewarding their perfection and dominance. What are your thoughts on today's topic? I truly want to hear your thoughts and theories of what kept these iconic programs out of the national championship picture in the comment section below. And I really hope you enjoyed watching this video, just as much as I enjoyed making it for you. And if you found value in this video, please share this with your friends and your family. And remember to hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe. And by subscribing, you'll never miss an episode of College Football Legends. Until next time.